Today I'm talking to ARI's Onkar Ghate about religion in America. Onkar is a senior fellow here at ARI and our chief content officer. And I'm Steve Simpson, ARI's Director of Legal Studies. Morning, Onkar.
Hi, Steve.
Okay, so recently you've been giving a series of talks on religion versus freedom is the title, I think. And I want you to kind of summarize your point here, but let me just set it up by saying that your main point, or at least where you start, is by saying that so long as religion is associated in people's minds with capitalism and freedom, the battle for freedom really can't be won. So give us your kind of summary point on that. What's your basic argument there?
One way you can put it, and this goes back to something that Ayn Rand emphasized and why she said she was not a conservative, is that if you put on the same side religion and capitalism, or freedom and faith, what you're saying is my argument for freedom, the case for freedom, the case for capitalism rests on faith. And that means that the reason, knowledge, science, evidence belongs on the other side. So you're giving somebody a really, really inhuman choice. You're saying, because capitalism is the system of progress, it's what lifted man from an abysmal standard of living in 2 centuries to undreamt of prosperity. It's the system of progress, of dynamism. And you're saying that belongs with faith, tradition, the backward view. And most people will get, like, what's so great about the modern world is science and technology and reason. And if that's not on the side of capitalism, then there's got to be something wrong with capitalism and freedom. So that association, and particularly the idea that the case for freedom or capitalism rests on faith and religion, that no, if I think I'm on the side of science, technology, then I can't be on the side of freedom and capitalism.
What impact does that have, do you think, on reasonable people? I mean, one of the interesting parts of the talk is you think people are rejecting capitalism, but expand on that a bit.
Yeah, I think it has a real impact on reasonable people, and particularly young people, who I think on the whole are relatively unpolitical. Right. So they're not immersed in the latest conflicts in Washington. Many of them don't even vote. But if they sort of think, what side am I on of these two things? The side that is against science, is against evolution, is against contraception, is against abortion, right, is against homosexuality, is against immigration, because I think it's the same kind of religious mindset. There's sort of us, the religious believers, against the outsiders, that kind of backward, tradition-bound, authoritarian mentality. That is not attractive to a young person. Right. And if he thinks what goes with that is freedom and capitalism, then no, there's got to be something better than that, and that's where they're going to be looking. Right. And when you look at the statistics in the 2012 election, so many of the young people were on the side, whether or not they voted, were on the side of Obama and the Democrats. And I think that's in significant part, it's a protest against what the Republicans stood for. Right.
So you are characterizing right and left in a particular way, and you're saying, I think, that there's your view of how we should characterize right and left versus the sort of popular view of that. But expand on that a little. You talked about the conservative religious side, but talk a little bit about, first, how do people view the left as the response to the right? I mean, implicitly, I think you're saying there that the left is the side of science. But then give your view. What's the real way to think about these two sides?
The real way, so I've talked a little bit in what I said before about the faith-based mentality is an authoritarian mentality. We've got a book, or we've got scripture, or we've got a spokesman like the Pope who's an authority who we listen to, and he's infallible, the Bible's infallible. Right. There's that mentality. And that mentality, I think, belongs on the side of statism, right, of socialism, of our modern regulatory welfare state. So the package should be thought of authoritarianism, which religion is one aspect of, and our modern regulatory welfare state, which tells us from birth to death, from cradle to grave, how we are to live, what our education is going to be. Think of federal government setting Common Core standards and things like this, of who we can employ, what employment questions we can ask a job applicant, what happens with our health care. It's massively government controlled. Our retirement is controlled by Social Security. This is government telling us what to do, is dictate. It's an authoritarian. And if you think there's something wrong, because I think there is something wrong with an authoritarian mentality, and what young people respond to is, I don't want to be part of this anti-evolution, tradition-bound, anti-contraception, anti-woman mentality. That's an authoritarian mentality. And if you really oppose that, you should be opposed to what the authoritarianism on the left as well. And that what we have to try to argue and really convince young people of, it's science and capitalism belong together. And they're both aspects of progress and of the dynamism of Western culture.
So, and the parallels kind of go even beyond the authoritarianism too. So one of the points you made is that on the side of religion, through history, you've had kings and popes. Yes. There's something similar to that on the left as well. Expand on that a little, because that's a fascinating point that I don't think people see.
The left, the modern left is, I think, really a secularization of religion. This is what happened in Europe in the late 18th and into the 19th and then 20th centuries. You've got, so a secularization of religion means to take all the essence of religion, but divorce it from appeal or reference to the supernatural. So gone were references to God and to miracles and that kind of thing. But what placed it, and this is an argument that Rand made, and I think is exactly right about what happens, is what replaces God is a worship of society. So that's the secularization. Now it's this worldly entity that you're supposed to worship it. It's an authority to which you owe service and obedience. And the society can be couched out in different ways. It can be the nation, so the rise of nationalism. It can be a race, as in Germany. Or Japan had aspects of that as well. It can be the proletariat, and then you get communism. So the group can be, or what counts as society to which you owe obedience and allegiance and service. That can be cashed out in different kinds of ways. But that's what happened. And so you got sort of the intellectual spokesman of that movement, somebody like a Marx. And notice how the communists thought of Marx. He's infallible. We all have to follow what he said. He's the equivalent of a pope. And then you got the people who put that kind of doctrine into political power. And if you think of Europe, I mean, just think of the sort of authoritarian political figures of a Napoleon, a Bismarck, a Stalin, a Lenin, a Mussolini, a Hitler. You get that, putting that kind of intellectual authoritarianism into political practice, and that's the equivalent of a king. So you saw the rise of pope-like figures and king-like figures, secularized, but it's the essence of what the union of religion and political power was, secularized. Right. And that's, the left is very much about that kind of authoritarianism. Right.
Is there anything like that king and pope sort of coupling in modern America today? I mean, if you listen to the conservatives, they'll say that Obama is acting like a king, and there's something to that, although one could say the same thing about a lot of conservative presidents, George W. Bush being one of them. He approached things in much the same way. So, but that would be, so there's the king kind of role as the president and a lot of politicians. What's the Pope side of that, the moral authority? Where's that coming from in modern America today?
It comes from, I think, the intellectuals, and many of whom, or most of whom, are on the side of controlling the American citizenry. Right. So if you think of, again, back to the modern regulatory welfare state, the reason we have an FDA, an FCC, an SEC, and I mean the whole alphabet soup of regulatory agencies that tell us in minute detail what we can and cannot do, the reason we have that is because the intellectuals argue that we need these kinds of authorities to tell us what to do, that without the FDA, we would be all so stupid to take drugs that are harmful to us, and we'd be poisoning ourselves. And companies, because they're driven by the profit, which the left portrays as some corrupt motivation, rather than what you're doing is creating wealth. It's some corrupt motivation. So they're out to get us, and we're too stupid to avoid all the traps they set for us. So you need the wise government to tell you how to live and what to do, what drugs to take. And so they have to approve everything, for what kinds of uses the drugs can be made. And that comes from an intellectual view of where the people who run things. So that kind of elitism that people talk, there is that element that is bad in American or our intellectual culture.
So let's circle back a little bit and expand a bit more on your point about religion. And I want to specifically focus on the fact that conservatives have long held and argued that America is a Christian nation, or at least a religious nation. Today it's more religious nation. It used to be more Christian, but it's basically the same idea. And here's the thing, they're not crazy. I mean, they're not totally wrong about this. There's some evidence, there's something that they're hanging their hat on. And I'll point to the Declaration of Independence as the obvious source of part of this view. Mm-hmm. So it refers to nature as God, it refers to the Creator being the source of our rights. So what's your view? I mean, there's something going on here. They're not totally wrong, but in essence, they're wrong. So give us
I definitely think they're essentially wrong about it. Let's start with the Declaration of Independence. What's crucial to the Declaration of Independence is not the view that there's a creator who created man. What is crucial is that where rights come from is nature, which means man's nature and the nature of reality. And then they talk, well, the nature of reality comes from God. But what's crucial is that reality has a nature, man has a nature. And given those two things, what man has to do in order to live and prosper is he has to think for himself. He has to then work and put those thoughts into action in the pursuit of his own life and happiness. So you get the right to liberty, to property, to the pursuit of happiness. This is how a person, an individual, has to live if he's to prosper here on earth. And that's set by his nature and the nature of the world, that there's not wealth out there. We have to create it, we have to produce it, we have to figure out what to produce. That's the nature of reality and our nature. And it's, in the end, irrelevant to the argument if you view that as coming from God. Indeed, I think it undercuts the argument, because people think, well, rights couldn't be absolute unless they were given from God. But it's exactly the reverse. They're absolute because the nature of reality is absolute and the nature of man is. They're unchanging. This is the way man has to live and prosper. And if his rights are negated, if he's not able to think for himself, if he's not able to own property, if he's not able to pursue his own happiness, he can't live and prosper. That's a fact. And if it were really true that this comes from God, then God could change it. He could have a miracle and say, no, now I'm changing all the rules and so on. And it would be totally non-absolute. So the Declaration of Independence, properly understood, the argument is in essence a secular argument about the rights of man. And the grafting on of a religious view is actually, if anything, undercutting of what there is. And this is more generally what is going on, I think, with the birth of the United States. It is given birth to in the most un-Christian period of Western history since the rise of Christianity. So once Christianity gains sort of political and cultural power, the 17th and 18th century are the least Christian periods, because they're periods in which intellectually and morally, politically, the West is trying to lessen and dramatically lessen the influence and impact of Christianity. So and it's called the Age of Reason and not the Age of Faith. And it's not an accident that that's what this historic period is called. It's the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment, because faith is being put way on the back burner and in many ways is seen as a problem. And what is rising is science, the whole scientific revolution. That demonstrates the power of reason, and that each individual, if he uses his reason, can know things and can learn to master the world, to achieve things, to be innovative, to create property. So you get science, you get the power of reason, you get the importance of knowledge, and that all culminates in, so you can live a happy, prosperous life in this world, in this life. That's all a non-religious, very anti-Christian view. Science replaces religious superstition. Reason replaces the power of faith. Knowledge replaces ignorance, and that there was a real argument, I think exactly right, that religion in so many ways left people ignorant and wasn't about educating in the pursuit of knowledge. And it's not about looking to a next world, doing penance, feeling that it's not about original sin, it's about the pursuit of your own happiness. So that is all very anti or non-Christian. And then the implementation of that politically in terms of the doctrine of the rights of man, there's nothing more unchristian than the pursuit of happiness. The Christian view is your whole orientation should not be to yourself and happiness, but to God and secondary to other people. So the idea that that's based in religion, I think, is wrong. And then there was an explicit attempt to separate church and state. And that we need a government that is not at all based on or operates by appeal to religion. And the idea then that the American system, which is the first to in principle, remove religion from political power, the idea that somehow the country's founded on religion is, I think, completely wrong.
So, but that idea has persisted. It persisted through the 19th century and persists up to today. And it had an impact on how people thought about limited government and individual rights. And let me preface this by saying, as a lawyer and knowing a bit about the history of America from a legal standpoint, you see the idea of natural rights at the founding, but that tapers off pretty quickly. I mean, really surprisingly quickly, early in the 19th century, legal thinkers abandoned the idea of natural rights. And I mean more than just legal thinkers. But I explain why that happened and how, sort of give a sense of what was going on at the time and who sort of assumed the mantle of defending freedom and capitalism. How did that kind of shake out?
Yeah, and it is, I think there's at least two major forces going on. And it's linked to the point that if you try to make a connection between freedom and religion, or freedom and faith, or you say rights are based in religion and faith, it's an example of undercutting yourself, that rights are a tremendously positive innovation in political theory. But to argue that, well, they're basic, or the essence of the case for them is that they come from God, they require faith in God, and so on. And this is part, as you asked in the previous question, the Declaration of Independence makes that kind of link. The more people question, look, this whole appeal to God, to the supernatural, to the miraculous doesn't make sense. Well, if that's where rights come from, and this is the defense of rights, then rights they don't have any foundation, they don't have any basis, they're a superstition. So the defenders of rights don't have a very good argument, and it's seen more and more as, well, your case rests on faith, but we're trying to be rational, scientific, and so on, so that can't hold water, so something has to be radically wrong with that. And then you got so that's the defenders, they have a hopeless defense in the end, because they're linking it to faith and to God and to religion. And then you have the people who have, no, we have a different view. And we have a more scientific view and a more rational view. And the secularization of religion in the 19th century was all done in the pretense of science. So take, for instance, one of the people at the moral level who attacked rights were the utilitarians. And they viewed themselves as scientific, and we're disassociating ourselves from appeal to superstition, to God, to faith. This is a scientific, focused on this world, focused on happiness viewpoint. Now, it was not an individual's happiness, and this is part of now society is becoming what everyone is told to serve and to worship. So it's the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So it's now a collective, and you're supposed to care not about your own happiness, but the happiness of the collective. There's that kind of view, but it's couched in scientific terms. Now, I think in the end it's not scientific, but it's couched in that way. And then if it's, well, are you going to be on the side of science or on the side of faith? If you're on the side of faith, you're on the side of rights. And if you're on the science, you're on the side of a view that's the opposite of rights. And it more and more, that's the direction in which it went. And it's understandable that it...
And you get somebody like Jeremy Bentham saying rights are nonsense on stilts, right?
Yes.
And he's a utilitarian. So let me talk a little bit, I want to pick up on that and kind of talk a little bit about consequences today from this kind of view. And I want to set it up by pointing to an article I read recently, which I think is a really interesting article. It's flawed in a lot of ways, but it's really kind of fascinating the way it sets this. It was written in a publication called Market Watch. And the title of this article is something like Ayn Rand versus Adam Smith, the only midterm election that matters. It was written right around the midterm elections. And the interesting part of this is that the writer, who's, as far as I can tell, he's a leftist, he's criticizing conservatives for siding with Ayn Rand, as he sees it. We would say conservatives are not siding with Ayn Rand, and instead of siding with Adam Smith. But the interesting thing is he poses the Ayn Rand and Adam Smith as opposites. Now, most people, I think, would look at them as allies, right? Because they're both in favor of capitalism, they're both in favor of free markets. I actually think this guy is onto something, because part of what he's pointing to is Smith was more of a, I don't know if he wouldn't call him a utilitarian, he would probably refer to him more as an altruist, which I tend to think is right, but I want you to expand on this. But ultimately what he says is this: Smith's view of capitalism is that capitalism's purpose is to serve the public good. And Ayn Rand's view is that capitalism's purpose is to set individuals free and allow them to serve their own good. I think he's right about that, but I want you to expand on this, because it seems very similar to what you were just talking about with the utilitarians. And if you look at the right today, a whole strain of the right is very much utilitarian. That seems to be undermining their position, but I want to get your view on that.
Yeah, I think definitely, and this was Rand's view as well, that she thought the crucial conflict or contradiction in America that had to be resolved, the way she would put it, it's between capitalism and altruism. And let me put that in a little different terms. You could put it, it's between what the essence of capitalism is, which is the pursuit of profit, of your own individual profit. But another way you can put that, or the pursuit of profit, is an aspect of the pursuit of your own happiness. So the conflict is between the right and the moral, which means the moral right, that morally what you should be doing is pursuing your own happiness, versus a viewpoint that says, no, that's exactly what you should not be doing. It's evil to do that. And the altruist view is what altruism means. It doesn't mean kindness or benevolence or generosity. It means, it's Latin for otherism. And it means morally, your focus should be on others, not self. And it's really, in the end, its dominance today comes from religion. Not only from religion, but religion and secularized religion. So it's more than anything, Christianity is what taught the Western mind that morally, your whole orientation should not be towards self, it should be towards God and to your neighbor. And the secularization of religion says, well, forget about the orientation to God, we're going to really play up the orientation to your neighbor, to the group, to society. But it's definitely not focused on yourself. That's exactly what's evil. So to be focused on your own happiness, selfishness, self-interest, prosperity, all that is evil. It's to be focused on other people. And so what altruism says is that morally, the moral justification of your existence, of your right to be alive, is, are you serving other people or not? And capitalism is so obviously a system which says you do not have to serve other people. That's not what life is about. It's wrong that the collectivist and statist system, you had to serve a king, you had to serve a pope, you had to serve the aristocracy. That whole viewpoint, you had to serve the Tsars, you had to serve the proletariat. I mean, you had to serve the German race. All service is out. That's not what life is about, an orientation to others. It's about the pursuit of your own happiness. And the reason so many people in the millions came to America was to pursue their own happiness. And unless that's defended at a moral level, to say that's what morality is about, capitalism is going to lose, because it's a system that our whole moral view says is wrong. Yeah. That the pursuit of happiness is wrong, the pursuit of profit is wrong, the pursuit of selfishness is wrong. So that contradiction has to be resolved. Yeah. And Adam Smith is very much, and certainly he is taken as, so there's some debates in scholarship about what exactly Adam Smith's own views were, but he's certainly taken as the justification of capitalism. Yes, it's a problem that it's about the pursuit of profit, selfishness, and so on, but it somehow transmutes that into the public good, that everyone's better off, and that's its moral justification. So if you think of it, you can think of it like this. that he has an argument that when you and I trade, it somehow benefits others and the public good. And that's what justified that we're allowed to engage in a voluntary trade. And from Rand's perspective, there's no outside justification necessary. When we trade, if I buy a car from you, you'd rather have my money, you're better off. I'd rather have this car, I'm better off. We both gain, we're both pursuing our profit, we're both being selfish. And that's all the justification. We're both advancing our own happiness. That's all the justification it needs. Its impact on other people, some alleged public good. And so it's not about service to others, it's about pursuing your own happiness. And Adam Smith is taken as what he shows about capitalism is it's not really about pursuing your own happiness. And that's in the end crazy. Nobody can really believe that that's how a capitalist system works.
I mean, that's one of the things that's frustrating to look at the debates. And I think this writer points that out. And the left has the right on this one time after time. You can see in the inequality debate, they point and they say, look, guys, this is about getting rich. Capitalism is about rich. It's about enjoyment, it's about luxuries, it's about and that's so obvious, you can point to it. And so the conservatives seem like hypocrites constantly. And they set themselves up for the criticism. Look, this is obviously not what capitalism is about. Anybody can see that. And if the best you have here is that it serves others, well, you're admitting that it's immoral.
Yes, and the link to religion is an aspect of what undercuts the conservatives in regard to this. Because they are... The Sermon on the Mount, if you take Jesus' most famous pronouncements, is so thoroughly altruistic. It's so thoroughly about other people and the downtrodden and the meek and the poor in spirit. And your whole orientation is supposed to be, what do they require, not just what does your happiness or life requires. And if they really mean that, then the left says, well, you should be on the side of socialism and statism and the regulatory welfare state and the entitlement state. And they're right, the left's right about that. So it's so undercutting to the case for capitalism.
So let's talk a little bit about one legal fight that's going on right now, or actually has gone on, the Hobby Lobby case. You're going to be speaking on that as well. And just for background purposes, Hobby Lobby is the case that came out last June, Supreme Court. It was the latest challenge to the Obamacare. And in this case, it was the challenge to the contraception mandate. Going into this case, my view of it was, this is a case that I love. I wish both sides could lose. And the reason I thought that was, on the one hand, you have Obamacare, which is this horrible law that compels us. It's going to change the insurance market. It compels us to buy insurance. It's a horrible authoritarian law. But on the other side, you have people who are complaining about this, rightly in one sense, I think, but I want you to expand on this, that it violates their freedom of religion by requiring them to finance, in essence, and this is a company, Hobby Lobby, which bills itself as or views itself as a religious company, and they don't want to have to provide insurance to their employees that requires the purchase of contraceptions or covers contraception. And there's some argument. I'm not religious, obviously, and I object to their basic take on contraception, but I get the point that yes, this law compels them to do something that they should have a right not to do. But the problem is that I think the left criticized the decision because the decision sided with Hobby Lobby and said that they have essentially a religious exemption to this contraception mandate. And the interesting thing about the left's criticism is it looks like the law or the decision actually sets up a religious test, which is the exact opposite of what the First Amendment's supposed to do. It essentially says a small group of people, because they're religious, are exempted from a law that applies to everybody else, which is crazy. I mean, so that's why I say both sides should have lost. What's going on here? Why did this happen? And give us kind of your take on what the fundamental error is in thinking that led to a case like this.
Yeah, I think the issue is that the idea of religious freedom has been detached from its wider context. And the wider context is the individual's right to be intellectually free, to form his own thoughts, his own judgments, and for those to then guide his action, that he can put those into action. And if you think, for instance, of the First Amendment, it's not only about freedom of religion, it's also about free speech, and that puts it in a wider category, that it's about intellectual freedom. And if you think of it at that level, there would be no difference between Hobby Lobby objecting to the contraception mandate because they have, I think, as you said, I definitely agree, backward views of women and of sex and of contraception. But they can hold backward view. I mean, that's part of what intellectual freedom protects. It protects also bad and wrong views. So you can hold that kind of view, but why couldn't somebody object, say, why couldn't you object that you find Obamacare profoundly immoral? Not for religious reasons, but for secular moral reasons. You find, and you want to be exempt from it. And if that is no, it's only religion that can, then it seems like you're going against the other aspect of the First Amendment, which is you can't establish religion. You can't give it special privileges and so. And you can't resolve this issue if all you're focused on is religion. You have to see it, there's a wider issue at stake here, and what it was supposed to protect is intellectual freedom, so that people should be free to decide for themselves. Now, this is the kind of health insurance I want, this is what I would cover for other people. All those kinds of decisions someone should be able to make for themselves. But once you have a kind of view, which is the view I think now in law, in both, I mean, on all branches of law, from the judges to the Congress, so, is that the government can in effect do almost anything and control and regulate almost any sphere of action. So they can decide, well, the government has an interest in providing insurance, and insurance of this exact form, and it has to cover contraception. So, and then it becomes a whole issue of, yeah, but aren't we trouncing on the rights of people when we do? And you are, but you're doing it much more than just the religious people when you're doing that. You're doing it to everyone who would want to go a separate way and say, no, I disagree with this, and have to be able to free to act on what I want to do.
So the solution here, I mean, I'll put the solution in more concrete terms, would be we have to have a government that it respects rights, but it's not as large and sprawling and all-controlling. But give a little bit more to what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and if you think of what the principle is at the time that the Constitution is written and what the idea of intellectual freedom means, it meant, and this is one way, for instance, Jefferson would formulate it, is the government is unconcerned with a citizen's ideas. It's neither trying to censor any of its ideas, religious or secular ideas about science, about geography, about history. It's not in the province of saying, no, you can't hold these ideas, nor of encouraging any particular view of history or of geography or of religion. So it does neither of those things. It only can operate when we're talking about actions. But that is now taken as, oh, it can control any actions. But that's not the view at the time of the founding. It's actions that violate the rights of other people. Right. Then the government can step in. And then it's irrelevant if someone has religious motivations for what they're doing. So say you had a religion that a rite of passage when you're 16 is you have to rob somebody, because that really shows now you're a man. You can't do that, and it's not you're somehow violating their religious freedom. You don't have the freedom to violate the rights of others, and it doesn't matter if your motivation is religious or you're a communist and thinks, well, no, they don't have a right to property, so I can take it. That's irrelevant. You're now violating their rights, and you cannot do that. So there was a real principle there that would make it clear that, yeah, this is an issue of an exercise of religion, and you have to be free to do this, because you're intellectually free to do this kind of thing. You're not violating anybody's rights, and it's not the business of government to try to censor it or encourage it. So it doesn't fund it, it doesn't give special favors or anything like that. But once that government laws have gone so beyond trying to protect rights and prescribing things like robbery and murder to this is how insurance has to be written, and this is the health care you have to hold, and this is the health care that a company has to offer. Once it had, that has nothing to do with the violation of anyone's rights. Once it has that kind of power, it necessarily encroaches on people's rights, left and right, religious people, secular people. An aspect, I think, of what is going on as well is the Bill of Rights is completely reversed. Yes. And that's why religion now gets an exemption. Because the Bill of Rights, crucial to the debate was, do we really want this Bill of Rights? Because what it might then suggest to posterity is these are your only rights, and government can do anything so long as it's not stepping on these particular rights. And their view was, no, we're just trying to specify these are rights that would definitely the government can't step on. And if you think, say, of religion, state and religion had been so intertwined. So there, you can see a reason of really emphasizing the government can't do this, but it's not all it can't do. And so the idea that there's unenumerated rights that the citizens hold, we're not trying to give an exhaustive list of everything. But what you have now is that the government can do anything it wants unless the Bill of Rights seems to explicitly forbid it. Right. And that's why religion now has special status, because they mention religion and not the science and history and geography in the First Amendment. So I guess if you have religious objections to Obamacare, we might have to make some kind of accommodation, because we're stepping on your rights and we shouldn't do that all the time, at least. But all the other things, you don't have standing anymore. And that's, I think, a completely perverse view of the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, you've put your finger on one of the big debates in American legal history, which is how to understand the Bill of Rights and which rights to apply and how to apply them. And ultimately, it gets back to a point that you just made, which is we've kind of flipped the constitutional structure on its head. Alexander Hamilton once said that the Constitution itself is a Bill of Rights by limiting the power of government. And once you expand government, the Bill of Rights is all that's left. Now you're just piecemeal focusing on particular rights. But one thing I want to just make this connection here, you alluded to it, and let me do it this way by giving you a quote by Ayn Rand, and then I want you to connect it to what we're talking about. The quote is, and I think I have this right, a free mind and a free market are corollaries. So intellect or ideas and actions are connected indispensably. Expand on that a bit in this context.
Yeah, and another way that you would often put it is that intellectual freedom and economic freedom are together. They're aspects of freedom. And freedom of thought and freedom of speech, they're tremendously valuable, but the value disappears if you're not able to act. So this is when Jefferson said that government can only step in when it's action, it's not you can control every action. It is you have to be free to act on what you think, on what you value. If you disagree with something, you have to be able to walk away. So, and it was part of, if you think of the Establishment Clause, that they were arguing it's a tremendous violation of a person's freedom of thought if he has to fund, so now we're in the economic realm, if he has to fund a religion that he disagrees with, and that in many ways might be trying to oppress him and so that's a tremendous violation of his intellectual freedom in the economic realm. Right. So these two things go together, that economics, to be free to create things on, means the things I've thought about, the new inventions, and Edison who's producing a light bulb or a record player, he's putting his ideas into action. That's what economic creation is. Or from the other perspective, the whole reason you want to think for yourself is so that you can act in the world. So they go intimately together. And the idea that you can separate them, that somehow we still have freedom of thought and in America, but the government can control every action. You don't. The Hobby Lobby has lost its freedom of thought if it can't act on its own views. But everyone has. Everybody who objects to Obamacare and thinks this is wrong, it's destructive, it's immoral, but it's forced to do it, you've lost your ability to act on your own judgment.
So you talked a little bit about Jefferson's view of freedom and freedom of conscience. I want to focus a little bit on the First Amendment itself and ask the question, is the problem here with the First Amendment? But before you answer that, let me just expand on that slightly. Because one of the curious things about the First Amendment, if you look at the whole thing, it's about freedom of conscience and freedom of thought. And it covers all of the major ways in which one can express and think. It's speech, it's the right to petition the government, it's the right of association, it's obviously the right of what they thought of a big component of freedom of conscience back then was religion. Yes. Nonetheless, it singles out religion in a sense. And I want you to speak to the historical reasons for that, because they could have said freedom of conscience. They could have talked about the separation of, let's say, morality or moral thinking or just thinking of ideas and government, but they did focus on religion. There's a reason, I think, for that. And I want you to speak to that reason, because the confusion, I think, in modern times is they had a particular reverence for religion and that they really thought that that was the one thing that needed to be free. I don't think that's quite right, but that's what I want you to speak to.
Well, there's definitely at the time a connection between religion and morality, and that they think of that in many ways religion can undercut a proper moral view, but that religion properly understood and articulated is part of what leads to a moral citizenry. There is that kind of view, I think, definitely at the founding. So religion brings in morality to an extent. But I think one of the major reasons is, again, of thinking of what the Bill of Rights is doing, that it's specifying these are things government definitely cannot do. So the whole Constitution is limiting the powers of government by specifying this is what you can do and this is what you cannot do. And if you think that one of their worries, and it is not some kind of theoretical abstract worry, it's looking at centuries of history in Europe of when religion and the state have been intertwined, the destruction, the civil wars, the wars through the continent, the persecutions of people. We can't allow our government, this to happen to our government. So we need to specify explicitly that there's a separation of church and state. And that's both on the side of the state is not to persecute minority religions, and that's, or by establishing a major religion, therefore treading on the rights of others, and they all have to fund it and so on. So we have to say that you cannot establish a religion, and you can also not censor in any way. So that's the free exercise. And I think there's a definite reason, given that and we're still at a time when many religious people are demanding political power to specify, no, we've got a government that this does not take place in. And there's a special reason to single that out. And I think that is what the First Amendment is doing. And the other, it's not as though there's not other statutes of religious freedom at the time. So take Jefferson's in the state of Virginia. I think that's definitely central to the motivation of why we need this and need to specify it explicitly. And other rights we can leave unenumerated. Yeah.
So Onkar, I want to pause there, and when we pick up in the next segment, we can talk a bit about the new atheists, which I think is an interesting development in this whole idea of what's going on with religion in America.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks.